Hello, everyone. So this is the last video of the semester. Hope it's wrapping up nicely for all of you. We're going to close by talking about collective action in unions. I really wanted to spend a lot more time on this than what we're going to have, but with all the class cancellations and stuff, I think I'm going to just lay out kind of the broad framework of collective action problems, just like the main aspects of it. And I was going to apply that to a lot of things that we've talked about earlier in the course before spending a day exclusively on unions. But instead, I'm going to apply that collective action problem framework to the union problem specifically, and probably have you apply it to some other issues in the class in the assignment for the week. So we're going to start by talking about collective action problems in general. We're going to do a little bit of recent U.S. labor history, kind of explain how we ended up with the labor relations that we have today in the U.S. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that workers face in organizing themselves today, and kind of why unionization is more difficult than it once was. We're going to then kind of more specifically apply the logic of collective action to union activity. And then finally, I'm just going to close by talking about some of the empirical evidence for what unions do for workers, both members of unions and not members of unions. So, starting with collective action problems, there's kind of really two levels to think about this. There's the second order collective action problem, which is also called the coordination problem. And that's the need to develop social mechanisms of coordination and enforcement. So you can kind of think about it like this. Let's go back to our climate change issues earlier in the course. We need to solve our collective action problem about climate change. We need to limit carbon emissions. But before we can do that, we need some system of international governance that can enforce coordination and sanction people that violate or defect from cooperation. And so you can almost think about the second order collective action problem as establishing the rules of the game or society that then allows you to actually solve the problems you care about, which are the first order collective action problems or cooperation problems. And so these are problems that accompany various types of free riding related to public goods, externalities, and common pool resources. So we've already discussed, public goods, externalities, and common pool resources, and how markets maybe don't deal with those very well. And so oftentimes the way that we deal with those is we use kind of the structure we have from solving our second order problem to solve the first order problem, right? So cap and trade in the case of pollution. If we're just talking about pure provision of property rights as being a public good, that is a form of non-market coordination. It's coercion to prevent enforce mutual respect of other people's property rights. So because of this, we typically must solve the second order problem before we can address, there's a typo in the slide, but we must address the second order problem before we can address the first order problem, right? We need to coordinate before we can actually cooperate. So there's a really famous result in this literature called the zero contribution thesis. And the idea here is, absent any other sort of structures, no rational actor would contribute to the production of public goods because they could simply free ride off of their production. Yet, in reality, we see that public goods get produced. And so how does that happen? Well, we have other mechanisms to enforce cooperation. And so what are these types of enforcement? Well, there's kind of two aspects of it that you can think of. First, you can think of who's doing the enforcing, and then you can think of how that enforcement is being carried out. So in the first instance, we've got who. So if we're talking about first-person enforcement, that means that we're talking about essentially internalized values. You steal a candy bar from the supermarket and then you feel ashamed about it, right? You've internalized these pro-social values about, having a poor or having a negative outlook on theft, right? So internalized shame. Second person, it's the person you're actually dealing with. So, for instance, if, I go and I buy a bike on KSL, and the person I'm purchasing from threatens me or something, right? Fears about dealing with people on Craigslist or whatever, and just takes my money. The second person enforcement mechanism that would prevent that is the threat of retaliation from me. So right, it's this idea of it's whoever you're actively dealing with who's threatening to retaliate that enforces cooperation. And then finally, there's third-person enforcement, and this is where an outside party that's not involved in the transaction engages in enforcement behavior. This could be, the police. This could be just some third-party adjudicator. It was very common in kind of earlier times for family groups to serve this role because they want to preserve their reputation in the community. So, first and second person enforcement is typically going to be informal. This is all based around taboos, norms, and traditions. But third person enforcement can be either informal or formal, right? So, like I mentioned, third person formal enforcement would be like the law, right? So this is the purview of Constitution, laws, and rights. And in the informal sense, third-person informal enforcement could be something like getting a community leader involved or other family members getting involved to try to enforce taboos, norms, and traditions. So I think this often happens in, say, religious communities. So I've kind of flown over this framework very quickly, but this framework applies to a lot of different issues that we've talked about earlier in the class. Climate change, macro investment, education, even our example from the COVID week of hoarding commodities is a form of failure to solve a collective action problem. Global trade policy, and finally, what we're going to spend most of our time on today, unions. So, moving straight from there to recent U.S. labor history, I had you listen to those two podcasts. The first one was about the strike that made U.S. labor, and that was the United Auto Workers GM strike in 1937. It was a 44-day sit-in strike where workers just occupied the plants and stopped production. And the United Auto Workers won and kind of ushered in the standard union contract that would be the benchmark for all other unions and large manufacturers for decades to come. And by the 50s, 1/3 of workers were unionized, so it was a very large proportion of the workforce that was unionized. And then the podcast talked about how United Auto Workers power kind of declined with the fortunes of the U.S. automakers during the oil crisis, right? And so what you can kind of think about here is the U.S. automakers had a lot of market power and what we would call monopoly profits. And then when the oil crisis came, they faced new competition. Those monopoly profits were eroded, and so they were less able to distribute those monopoly profits that they once had to their workers. This is kind of, in a weird way, analogous to our discussion about the fissured workplace and franchisers before, right? Of you can't actually give in to workers' demands if you don't have monopoly profits sometimes. So anyway, this was kind of the norm for a long time. And then in the 80s, we had kind of a rapid decline in the power of unions, and the emblematic event of that is this PATCO strike of 1981, where it was the Professional Air Traffic Controllers organization, I believe, that went to strike against the federal government because all air traffic controllers were federal employees, and they threatened not to come to work because they wanted higher salaries. they were actually legally prohibited from striking, much like the teacher strikes we saw last year, right? Teachers are not actually allowed to go on strike because they're considered essential government workers. But it's kind of this thing in when you think about union activity where if you're a union that's legally prohibited from going on strike, the reason you're legally prohibited from going on strike is because that strike should be really, really effective, because you can bring large swaths of the economy to a halt, or it's such a big threat to public health and safety that the government would have to concede almost immediately, right? So this is why police officers, firefighters, EMS workers, teachers, and air traffic controllers are legally prohibited from striking. But that's not what bared out in 81. There was a large concerted effort by the federal government to essentially replace all of these air traffic controllers as quickly as possible. So they rushed people through training, they brought retirees back in, they brought in military controllers, and they were able to keep about half of all flights going by just hiring these scabs. So after the conclusion of all of this, 11,000 air traffic controllers were fired and banned for life from ATC work. This ban was later rescinded by Clinton about a decade later. But this strike isn't really important for what it did for air traffic controllers, or didn't do for air traffic controllers. It's important what it kind of did to the broader business culture. Because essentially, it emboldened business interests to essentially fight against their unions more vehemently. It kind of broke the labor capital accord that had prevailed for many decades prior to this. And it's also important to note that this is all happening kind of in the environment of increasing globalization and competition that makes unionized industries less competitive in the global marketplace because their labor costs are higher. And it makes outsourcing relatively more preferable to firms. And so this, as was mentioned in the podcast, this incident was quickly absorbed by the business literature, and within a year, it was in textbooks in business schools. And so the subsequent kind of regulatory response by the federal government that I'm not going to get into right now, but also this big cultural shift led to a gradual decline in unions. And so today, only about 1/10 of workers are now unionized. It's even lower if you exclude public sector workers. So the U.S. labor movement really rests upon the rubble of all of these events. And so unions face immense challenges in trying to actually organize today. And so we should probably talk about what unions are actually trying to do, though. So historically, they've pursued these three objectives. Economic redistribution via higher wages for unskilled workers. So unions tend to shrink the wage schedule, right? So people that would, at the high end, make lower, people at the low end make higher. And so it's really this kind of compressing of the wage structure, which in a way is part of solving the collective action problem, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Unions also want better workplace amenities and a location of control rights inside the firm. They want more worker autonomy over how labor is actually carried out, and they also want to make sure that workers have all the amenities to do their job effectively and safely. And finally, political representation. So what I talked about last week with, lobbyists and all of this, you can kind of almost think of unions as being using those same tools, but on behalf of their union members rather than on behalf of corporate America, though they are far less well-funded than the corporate lobbyists. So I really like this quote from the paper I had you read. Put another way, at the end of the day, what unions do is organize collective action on the basis of work. From strikes to pickets to phone banks to grievances, unions are powerful because they leverage the common interests that workers in a firm, occupation, or industry have into bargaining power and political power. So I think that just really sums up what union organizers think of themselves as doing. So where do union members come from is maybe kind of a very basic question here. Unions, new unions arise by being recognized through an election process administered by the National Labor Relations Board. The NLRB is this institution that was founded kind of in the Great Depression, the New Deal response. And so what usually happens is workers will petition. If they reach a certain threshold, then the employer is required to have a union election that the National Labor Relations Board administers. And then if 50% or more than 50% of workers at this single place of work say that they would want to have a union, then the union that they have associated with then becomes the legal representative vis-a-vis the firm of all the workers. And the important part about, because you can have a union without an NLRB election, but the thing about the NLRB process is if the workers win that election, then the firm is required by law to negotiate with that union in good faith. So they can't just shut the doors and kick all the workers out and fire them and refuse to negotiate with the union. So it does provide some form of legal protection for the union members. But today, it's actually quite rare for a new firm to become unionized through the NLRB process. It happens, but it's not the way that most new union members kind of come to be. Most new union members are simply joining already unionized firms, right? Like the Federal Longshoremen, the United Auto Workers, these big unions that have been around forever. That's kind of how most unions union members come into the movement. It's also important to note that the political control of the NLRB influences the NLRB election results. So there are very specific rules on what a employer can and cannot do during like the run-up period to an NLRB election, as far as like distributing materials to workers, changing policies, things like that. There's lots of limitations on that because they don't want the employer to unduly influence the process. But what we find is that when political control of the NLRB is held by Republicans, there are a large number of borderline losses. And that is not the case whenever it's controlled by the Democrats. And so there's this idea that maybe there's a lesser degree of enforcement of those rules when Republicans control the NLRB. So one big criticism that's leveled at unions, and that you've probably heard in your principles classes, is that they are inefficient. Essentially, what you can think about it is just like a monopoly creates inefficiencies in the product market, unions are essentially trying to establish a monopoly or some measure of market power over the supply of labor. So, in doing so, they're essentially creating the same sort of inefficiencies that a monopoly would. So it's similar in mechanism to a minimum wage law in creating a minimum wage law above the equilibrium level that generates a deadweight loss. However, as I think we've already talked about earlier in the course, market power can actually be a good thing if the party on the other side of the market also has market power, right? Monopoly power and monopsony power, in a way, push against one another. And if you essentially grant monopoly power to somebody who faces a monopsonistic buyer, it could actually result in a more efficient outcome than the one that currently exists. Not saying it's going to arrive at equilibrium, because this is a bargaining process, and so if it landed at the equilibrium market wage, that would be purely by chance. But thing is existence of a union does not necessitate inefficiency relative to what already exists. There's also some argument about efficiency in production. So workers often have better information about the tasks that they're doing than the bosses do. And so one way of describing this is as an inefficient allocation of control rights within the firm. Earlier in the course, in the labor section, I talked about kind of the difference between the highly hierarchical organization of American automakers in the 50s versus the team-based production method of the Japanese automakers that first started in like the 60s and 70s, and how giving workers more autonomy in the Japanese team system actually made the firm more efficient. And so in that way, unions can enhance worker productivity through giving them more control over the actual labor process. There's a number of reasons why unions declined. I kind of alluded to some of those earlier. Globalization is definitely one. Technological change, especially as it relates to globalization and means of communication and transport, definitely played a role. Increased skills of workers overall, because essentially if workers are more productive in these other industries, then they're going to be at the high end. They may be at the high end of the wage distribution, which would then make them less inclined to join a union because that would compress the wage structure. Firms also came to value flexibility in that, just-in-time manufacturing and all of these sorts of ideas were essentially geared at reducing fixed costs. And in our economic models, we usually think about labor as a variable cost. But if you've got a long-term union contract, that essentially converts your labor from a variable cost to a fixed cost. So firms didn't want to be tied down to these long-term contracts, and so they fought harder against their unions. Another important aspect of this, especially in the developed world, is the rise of service employment. Because most service jobs are less skilled, not in the sense that they may be easier or harder to do, but just the necessary certifications and human capital to get those jobs is typically much lower. And so essentially a strike has much less bite in the service sector because those workers are easily replaced. It's also important to note that service employments are typically going to be at the mass kind of large number of service workers are at the low profit end of the production chain. And so there actually aren't a lot of monopoly rents down there to distribute. So workers can't get very many concessions from their employers because the employers may not actually be able to afford them. So unions have declined. They face all of these challenges. What might be done to counteract against that? I think the paper makes an excellent point in saying that we cannot expect unions to return to their former power without radical policy changes, but then they go on to put more emphasis on alternative strategies that are more incremental, which I think is more kind of on the ground actual progress, may actually generate some progress. So exempting unions from some regulations has been put forward, facilitating recognition of unions and card checks, essentially making the NLRB process easier and more trustworthy. And card checks are where you have a workplace that is a union shop where only workers with union affiliation are allowed to work there through the agreement that the union has come to with the employer. But we'll talk about in a minute why those have kind of fallen away. Minority unionism, as well as making union stewards of large-scale benefits programs. So this is something that is done in many European countries. It's called the Ghent system, where unions are the ones that administer, for instance, unemployment insurance or public health care or things like that. I think that there would be a lot of political resistance to that in the U.S. because some of the reputations that unions have kind of had developed around them over the last few decades. But these are all kind of examples of policies. And what these policies are all aimed at is essentially making the choice of unionizing relatively more attractive to workers. And also to firms. But if we think about just the individual workers, the worker faces a very simple proposition. There are certain costs associated with the choice to unionize, and there are certain benefits. And all that these policies are doing is attempting to make the cost of unionization relatively less and the benefits relatively more, so that it makes it a much more attractive option. So moving on from that paper, let's just talk about some of the empirical observations of what unions do for workers. I have this report linked at the bottom of this week's page as well if you want to kind of dig into it. I'm just hitting some of the highlights and adding a few things from other papers as well. But and it's also put out by the Economic Policy Institute, which is admittedly a somewhat kind of left-leaning policy institute. So anyway, union members, just plain and simple, they make more and have better benefits than non-unionized workers. 28% higher total compensation, so that's including wages and other benefits. Unions also tend to reduce inequality in an overall and racial and gender terms. There are some caveats to the racial and gender terms, so let's address each of these one by one. Unions reduce overall inequality because they compress wage structures but shift them upward generally. So I think that's pretty simple. That just moves people up the income distribution as a block. In racial terms, whenever a firm has workers of different races within it, that compression of wage structure has the same effect. Also, union contracts typically establish very specific rules for advancement and promotion. And so it's very difficult whenever those are all written down essentially very legalistically to racially and gender discriminate. It becomes relatively more difficult because there are specific procedures and rules to advancement. Now, the issue being is that unions have not always enhanced racial and gender equality, and the reason is because of occupational crowding and systematic exclusion. So, for instance, for most of kind of the golden age of capitalism, African Americans and women did not have access to jobs that were kind of high-paying, partially because they were either systematically excluded from professions or systematically excluded from unions. One of the big splits in U.S. labor, the biggest union in the U.S. is the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO is a merger of two unions, the American Federation of Labor and the, why can I not remember what CIO stands for? Anyway, AFL and CIO merged. But the reason why I believe CIO was formed was that CIO wanted to unionize unskilled and black workers in the South, and the AFL refused to do that. And so that was kind of a big schism early on in the labor movement in the U.S., and later on they merged, right? So it is important to think about what unions can do, but it's also important to think about what unions are doing and for whom. So keeping that in mind, if workplaces do have a mix of races and a mix of genders, then they can enhance equality, but occupational crowding should be kept in mind. All right, so there are also spillover wage effects to non-union workers. So workers who are not unionized but work in a sector with at least a 25% union density, so 25% of the workers in that industry are unionized, those workers that are not unionized are still paid 5% more than workers in similar sectors that lack that 25% union share. So there's this pay spillover effect. To put that in perspective, the size of this effect in dollar terms is about the same size as the direct wage effect that unions have on their own members. So it's a very widespread effect. Union workers also have many more fringe benefits. So they've got 18% lower healthcare deductibles, 28% larger employer contribution towards pension plans. They actually have pension plans sometimes. More vacation time, and 14% more paid leave. So these are all kind of side benefits that union workers get to have. Union workers also train their members, so they help to enhance, not in all industries, but in many industries, unions help train their members, especially in like the construction trades, and they're safer as a result. We've got fairly strong empirical evidence that workers that go through union apprenticeship and training programs tend to have fewer on-the-job accidents than laborers that do not. And finally, just kind of a structural thing, is that unions provide due process at work, right? So as a worker here in Utah, any of us that have a job in Utah can be dismissed without cause for any reason with no justification and no means to appeal, because Utah is a right-to-work state. In many states in the U.S., I believe about half of them are right-to-work states. And even in a right-to-work state, due to the way the contractual agreements between employers and unions works, you have a union rep that is there during those interactions, and you are and the employer may be, depending on the specific terms of the union contract, be required to provide you some sort of reason for your termination, and the union may be able to appeal that on your behalf. So I've always found it somewhat ironic how Americans are very precious of their due process of law out in the world, but kind of shun those ideas the moment that they punch the time clock. All right. So that's just kind of some of the things that unions can do for both union and non-union workers. So let's kind of wrap up here by applying the logic of collective action to unions. So because of these spillover effects to other industries, we can think of that as a positive externality of unionization. And within the context of the firm, unions provide a public good, right? And this public good is negotiating on behalf of the workers of that firm. This public good can no longer be easily converted into a club good in most states, because union shops have been outlawed due to right-to-work laws. So the way that it once was is a union could negotiate with their employer and say, all right, we'll agree to these terms, but you can only hire union members. And that's what the card checks were. Employers wouldn't like this for a very good reason, right? This gives the union more power. They want a greater proportion of their employees to not be unionized, so if a strike does happen, it hurts them less. And so many states began to pass right-to-work laws. So they outlawed the union shop, but probably more importantly is they outlawed a way that unions were able to address the free rider problem. So you can think about if you've got a shop that isn't a closed union shop that has both unionized and non-unionized workers. The union workers don't just negotiate on behalf of the union workers, they negotiate on behalf of all the workers, because the same rules that they negotiate with the employer apply to all workers, even the non-unionized workers, right? And so these non-unionized workers are basically free riding off of the dues that the union workers pay that support negotiating with the firm. And so one way that this free rider problem was solved in the past is that unions negotiated with employers terms that they would take some union dues would be collected from non-union workers, a reduced rate compared to the union members. And this was basically meant to compensate the union for the costs of negotiating on behalf of all workers, even the non-unionized ones. But right-to-work laws also typically ban this practice. And so essentially, right-to-work laws have taken away all of the ways that the unions were able to deal with the free rider problem, which has made unionization far more difficult in right-to-work states. It's also important that within the scope of the union, enforcement of union activity is largely informal, right? There's no formal process to sanction a union member that crosses a picket line and goes to work. It's largely a way, most of the sanctioning happens through naming and shaming and internalized values. And so informal enforcement works pretty well in smaller groups, but as groups get larger and larger, informal enforcement becomes less and less effective because reputation effects aren't as persistent. Formal enforcement also seems helpful, but it's important to note that an LRB election win does not guarantee a union contract. So very often unions will win the NLRB election, but not be able to come to an agreement with the employer within 2 or 3 years. So just wrapping things up, Many economic and social issues can be framed as collective action problems. Unions have become far weaker than they once were in the U.S., even though they can deliver immense benefits to their members and generate spillover wage and policy effects. Unions are a collective action that requires expected benefits to be greater than expected costs for each of their members. And so they need some sort of enforcement mechanism to stave off free riding and other forms of defection. All right, that's all I got for today. Good luck wrapping up the semester, and I think just make sure to take a look at doing all of the discussion threads, because I think a lot of you still have many of those to go. I've made that due just the last day of finals, so you got a lot of time to kind of sort that out. All right, let me know if you have any questions, and been nice having you in class.